Rhythm and Light in Chicago, I'm Steve Ordauer, and welcome to Rhythm of Life. Today we hear part 2 of the fascinating interview host Bob Hercules conducted with the remarkably persistent and dedicated civil and human rights attorney Flint Taylor. Part 1 of this interview took a close look at the murder of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton and the 13-year legal battle that ensued to successfully change the public narrative of how Hampton died. If you have not heard this part of the interview, which is episode 9 of this podcast, please give it a listen first. This part of the conversation transitioned to another one of Taylor's landmark investigations that uncovered a systemic pattern of brutal torture in Chicago, which included the use of electric shock to elicit false confessions from suspects, led by the notorious police commander Jon Burge. Joining forces with community activists, torture survivors, other lawyers, and local reporters, Taylor and his colleagues at the People's Law Office brought a lawsuit against the offending Chicago police officers and the city of Chicago, as the struggle expanded beyond the torture scandal to the ultimately successful campaign to end the death penalty in Illinois and obtain reparations for many of the torture survivors. It set human rights precedents that have since been adopted across the United States. Both parts of this interview are explored in Taylor's groundbreaking book, The Torture Machine, published by Haymarket Books.
I wanted to just switch topics and talk a little bit about the main subject of your book, The Torture Machine, which is the story of Jon Burge and his midnight crew and the torture of many, many, many black men for over 20 years. Let's start out, just briefly summarize what happened on February 9th, 1982, when 2 uniformed Chicago cops were shot to death in broad daylight. Just give us a sense of what happened and what was the aftermath.
Well, the shootings of the Fahey and O'Brien, the two officers who were shot on February 9th, led to, because the perpetrators of the shooting escaped, led to the largest manhunt in the history of the city of Chicago. These were 2 white cops, and the perpetrators were African American. It happened in the black community on the South Side, and so the entire police force was mobilized and given a carte blanche to do whatever was necessary to catch the folks. It was just, there was an eyewitness, and he said there was one person who did the shooting, and then there was another person who was driving.
Right.
And for 5 days, there was a reign of terror on the south and west sides of the city.
Somebody referred to it as Kristallnacht.
Yes.
For the black community.
Exactly. That's what Jesse Jackson,
right? Jesse Jackson, right?
Referred to it as, and they found they were kicking in doors, and they were beating people up. They were grabbing people who they thought might know something and take them down to the station and beating them and actually torturing them. And the person who was in charge of this manhunt was a lieutenant from the Area 2 Detective Division on the South Side by the name of Jon Burge. And he was at the focus of all of this violence, racially motivated violence, and torture.
Right.
And so they initially found a couple of guys who they thought did it, and they brought them down and tortured them. But then it turns out that there was a lineup with the eyewitness, and he said they didn't do it. So they continued their reign of terror until they found the Wilson brothers, Andrew Wilson and Jackie Wilson. And Andrew was identified as the shooter,
mm-hmm.
and Jackie was identified as the driver.
Right.
And the evidence started to come out that they tortured Jackie and Andrew viciously. with electric shock, with suffocation, with beatings, and with Andrew's case, while they were electric shocking him, he was strapped across or handcuffed across a ribbed radiator, one of the old-fashioned steam radiators.
Right.
And so when he was being shocked, his chest and legs were going up against this red-hot radiator and burning him. So, of course, he confessed based over hours of torture, and Jackie gave a statement as well. And what they got out of Andrew was an admission that he was the shooter, and out of Jackie, they put in his mouth just enough for him to be held accountable in the crime,
even though he was most likely just the driver, and
he was
it came out later that he was sort of shocked himself at the murder.
Exactly right. That 36 years later, we ended up doing Jackie's case.
And Andrew had there were pictures of Andrew in which he looked, clearly it was torture on his face and his body.
Yes, there was burns on his chest, on his face, on his legs, and there was bruises on his head, and in fact, the lawyer who represented Andrew initially, Dale Coventry, a public defender, had the presence of mind to not only take pictures of all of that obvious injury, but he took pictures of his ears, because Andrew said that this torture device, which is of course the name of my book, The Torture Machine, has a picture of a replica of this machine, was a generator in a black box that had wires from the generator with clips on the wires, and so you could clip the alligator clips to the ears or to the fingers or the genitals or wherever, and then you would turn this generator. It had a hand crank, and you'd send electricity, and that's what Andrew said happened to him. And he said among the places that they attached these clips was his ears. Oh. And so the pictures of his ears when blown up showed these little marks, which were consistent with the alligator clips.
Oh, I see.
So there was all of this evidence that Andrew was brutally tortured. There was less physical evidence on Jackie. But this was all brought to court to suppress their confessions, and of course no judge in Cook County was going to throw out their confessions, no matter whether they were hung upside down for a week or not.
Right. That's just the way it was done.
Yeah.
You got involved a few years later in 1987. Is that right?
Yeah, it was.
And how did you get involved in this case?
Well, Andrew was convicted, got the death penalty. Mm-hmm. And his criminal case went on appeal, and ultimately the Supreme Court reversed based on all this obvious evidence of torture.
The U.S. Supreme Court or the Illinois?
The Illinois Supreme Court. And about that time, of course, Andrew was sent back for a second trial, and he was convicted again. But the second time he didn't get the death penalty. He got 2 life sentences. But Andrew, who was had a first-grade education, had handwritten out a federal civil rights complaint, same kind of complaint that, in the sense of the jurisdiction in 1983 complaint that we did in the Hampton case. He filed it on his own because no lawyer was going to really represent him.
No lawyer would represent him because he was not, in a way, an attractive
No, he was
defendant.
about the least attractive client from a lawyer's point of view that you could have, a black cop killer. The judge appointed a series of lawyers, none of whom wanted to do the case. So ultimately, Andrew reached out to us because he knew our reputation from the Hampton case.
Right.
And so we decided, we meaning the People's Law Office and myself, decided we would represent him because the obvious principle that nobody should be tortured, no matter what they're accused of or what they're even convicted of. And
right.
so we ended up as his lawyers, and we had a judge in that case, not unlike the judge in the Hampton case, who was extremely pro the police and against us and our client Andrew Wilson.
As were many judges, it sounds like to me.
Oh, definitely.
It's a litany of judges like that in your book.
Yeah,
that's one of the most, for a naive reader such as myself, I was shocked to see the number of judges who were so biased in favor of the police. And you mentioned the name of your book is The Torture Machine, and I've often thought that the title of the book has actually several meanings. One is the actual torture box that you talked about, the crank device, but also it, in a way, refers to the democratic machine and the whole system of cronies along the way that allowed this to happen. I wonder if you could talk about that, because that's such an amazing revelation from your book.
Yes, it was very self-conscious to call it the torture machine for just the same reasons that you just mentioned.
Right.
And as this case unfolded with Andrew Wilson, thanks in large part to the revelations to us of anonymously from someone who worked with Jon Burge, who was the main torturer of Andrew Wilson, it revealed that it wasn't just a one-off with Andrew and Jackie, but that this was a whole systemic program led by this Lieutenant Jon Burge on the south side of Chicago.
This is a letter from a policeman,
yes,
who worked there and sent to you anonymously, several letters.
Yes.
And
yes.
How did that affect your cases?
Well, it initially, because of we were actually on trial in Andrew's civil case that I mentioned earlier. Initially, as hard as we fought to bring to light, these other cases of torture that the anonymous source who we dubbed as Deep Badge.
Yeah, right, like Watergate.
Right. The judge wouldn't let us develop or introduce any of that evidence at trial, but it gave us a springboard into other cases of torture that we followed like a little the yellow brick road from one case
That's
to
kind
another.
of a bleak yellow brick road.
Yeah.
As I understand it, I mean, you didn't know the extent of this at first until you started getting these letters and started piecing things together, and then there were hundreds that you discovered.
Exactly.
Which is horrifying.
What these letters kind of laid out was, hey, it's not just Burge, and it's not just this one horrific case of torture, but that this is a total racist program that the prosecutors are involved in, that Richie Daley, who was the chief prosecutor at the time, knew about, that the highest levels of the police department knew about it, and that it was, here's some names of some other people you should investigate who were also tortured. And so that gave us the template for the next 30 years of our work in terms of exposing the depth and breadth of the police torture scandal here in the city of Chicago. And as you say, it couldn't have happened without not only the police and its code of silence countenancing it and encouraging it all the way up to the superintendents of police, but that the prosecutors, from the ones who were in the station houses while the torture was happening, to the prosecutors who put on these tortured confessions as the bulwark of their cases against these African American torture victims, to the leaders of the state's attorney's office, Richie Daley and company, to the judges, many of whom were former state's attorneys. Mm-hmm. So that was the chain. And of course, when Daley became mayor, then, of course, it was also the City Hall that as he switched hats from the prosecutor who countenanced and encouraged and covered up the scandal. He then became the mayor and was in the same position for the next 15 or 20 years after he left the state's attorney's office and became the mayor.
So he was suppressing all this evidence and all these stories of men who had been tortured horrendously, because it would implicate himself in an earlier role before he became mayor.
Yes, and he the Wilson case, all this evidence of torture by Burge on Andrew particularly and Jackie as well, was brought to him by the superintendent of police at that time, Richard Brezek.
Right.
And Brezek said, "I'm not going to do anything about this. Mm-hmm. Basically, you're the prosecutor. You do what you're going to do."
So he sent it up to Daley,
yeah,
so he would wash his hands of it.
Yeah.
Even though he had seen the photographs of the torture of Andrew Wilson, which were horrific. I've seen the photos.
Yes.
They are horrific, and I don't know how anybody could deny that he wasn't severely tortured.
But here's Daley, who's the chief prosecutor, and he's the one who's in charge ultimately of the prosecution of these two black cop killers. And if in fact he does the right thing and investigates and prosecutes his guy who took these confessions, Burge,
right,
then what happens to his prosecution of Wilson? And
right. It all falls apart.
Yeah. And so he elects the road of prosecuting Jackie and Andrew and sending them to death row, or at least Andrew, rather than to do the right thing in terms of the police torture that's laid on his desk. And that is the start of this, this cover-up that the prosecutors from the top down are implicated in. Because if Burge had been, prosecuted and fired back in '82 when it was first clearly known that he was involved in this, then there was another 50, 75 cases that arose during Daley's subsequent leadership in the state's attorney's office that may well not have happened.
Right, and think about how that would have affected those 50 men, per se. John Conroy, the journalist who wrote a lot for the Chicago Reader, was one of the people that brought this out into the public. Can you talk about how important his work was? Extremely important. John was covering the trials that we did in 1989, and the trials were the trials that Andrew Wilson initiated with that pro se complaint that we took over. Right. And we went to trial, and John sat in the courtroom every day. We did a 8-week trial, and during that 8-week trial was when the Deep Badge first gave us the information. The letters that you received. And so John then was a witness to all that was going on, and the judge keeping us from putting this evidence before the jury. And what happened was, after 8 weeks of trial, the jury couldn't decide. It was a racially mixed jury, and the black folks on the jury said, "Well, this is outrageous.
I don't care who he is. We want to find for Andrew. And the white folks on the jury were, solidly in the camp of Burge, a decorated Vietnam veteran.
Right.
He was a commander of police at the time we were doing the trial.
So the jury is like a microcosm of Chicago, such a divided city.
Yeah, definitely. But so we went back to a second trial, and Jon sat through that one as well. And so during this second 8-week trial, and he's compiling this evidence, he's hearing about from us and our attempts to try to get this developing evidence of a pattern. He's learning of all these other men who were tortured. He's learning about this incredible story of these two trials, and so he, at the beginning of 1990, writes this remarkable 20,000-word piece in the Chicago Reader, which was titled "House of Screams."
Right.
Because it was at the Area 2 where most of this torture took place was at across from a fire station, and I think someone told him from that fire station or from living nearby that they could hear the screams coming from Area 2. So that they titled it House of Screams. But he then laid out the two trials. He laid out the other people that he now was learning about. He laid, who were tortured. He laid out the deep badge and what, all of that. And it was a remarkable investigative piece. It was journalism at its absolute finest. And Jon thought that it would lead to a real, not only an expose, but that it would lead to some real investigation. It would lead to that the media would pick up on it. And that it would that this was how outrageous and systemic and racist all of it was, but it went nowhere in the sense that none of the major straight media picked up on it, and he then continued for the next 10 or 15 years to write other important pieces in the Reader.
He had the same persistence pill that you must have taken.
He did, until they told him they no longer needed him at the Reader in 2007.
Yeah.
Which
but I mean, it was a landmark work and did, in a way, lead to many things that came afterwards, not directly, but, you have to say he was part of the path. I mean, one of the things that came out of this case has been reparations, which has been amazing and has really, I think, had an effect across the country. Can you talk about the reparations?
Yes, and at first I want to totally agree with you about Jon's impact. I mean, Jon had a major impact, and as you say, his persistence and his investigative skills and his writing skills and his commitment to the truth was, in terms of just a shining example to media folks across the generations. And
it's really the best of media, why we need journalism in these times and why we needed it back then and we still need it now.
Definitely.
But tell me a little bit about the reparations that came about.
Well, reparations was first suggested by Mary Powers and Citizens Alert back in the early 1990s, but there was so much else that was being pursued at that time in terms of getting people out of jail and in terms of civil suits, in terms of death row and people who were tortured and put on death row, that it never was really seriously part of the what was being
not seriously discussed at the time.
Yeah, right. It was suggested, but it
was in the air. But a lot of people discounted it and said it was going to be direct payments to people, and they were.
Well, it didn't even get to that point. At that point, Bob. I mean, it was just. I just want to give credit to Mary and them for actually suggesting it, but it never became even a demand really beyond being mentioned. But what happened was, we fast forward for about 15 years, and Stan Willis and Black People Against Police Torture took up the torture scandal in the black community, and they held town meetings, and they formulated a series of demands, and one of their demands was reparations. And reparations in the sense of not only money reparations for those men who had no lawsuits because of the statute of limitations, but other non-financial reparations.
One is that it has to be taught in the high schools in Chicago, which is amazing.
That came later.
Okay.
There's phases here, and that phase, Stan and the folks in the town halls, Larry Kennan, and they helped to draft a statute which Kwame Raoul helped to and Representative Turner helped to get through the Illinois legislature, which was the Torture Commission. It created a torture commission.
Right. That's right.
And that was a great accomplishment. It ultimately, and then that was like in 2008, 2009, and then the reparations that were passed in 2015 started to become a real issue when an organization started that was actually of artists, and they were looking at ways of dealing with the police torture scandal, and they came up with the demands that ultimately were adopted by the city council in 2015, and that is what included teaching it in the public schools, teaching the torture scandal in public schools, a public memorial, $100,000 to each of the surviving torture survivors who hadn't received compensation through the courts, a center on the south side of Chicago, where torture survivors and their families and others could be receive treatment and gather.
Which we're still waiting for that.
No,
is that running?
That's been running for 2 or 3 years.
Oh, has it? Okay.
What we're waiting for is the memorial.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And the teaching in the schools is happening and has for several years, and many torture survivors go and speak to the classes. There's a curriculum. I, from time to time, speak as well. But that struggle, which the group that formed was Chicago Police Torture Memorials, in I think it was 2012 or 2013, and then it became a much broader struggle with it was very intergenerational and very interracial in its component, and it was able to coalesce at a time when Rahm Emanuel was running for re-election, and he was under fire from the African American community for shutting down schools and shutting down health clinics and mental health clinics and all of that. And so a lot of very creative demonstrations were led by these groups in 2014, and it led to Rahm and City Council adopting the reparations package that the groups, Chicago Police Torture Memorials and others formulated. And yes, it was completely a remarkable accomplishment. And another part of the reparations was the apology by Rahm Emanuel to the men.
Right.
At a city council meeting.
Right, I've seen that. It's amazing, especially given who Rahm Emanuel is, but it's very interesting to watch.
Yeah, it was quite detailed, and I suppose to the degree that Rahm Emanuel could ever be accused of doing anything heartfelt, seemed like he almost meant it.
Yeah.
But the men, I mean, obviously that was important.
Yeah.
And it was at a city council meeting at which time all 50 city councilmen, we were up in the back with about 15 of the survivors, and city council turned around and faced them and clapped.
Huh.
Which,
Interesting.
some of the same city council people who had derided us over the years.
Been on the other side.
Yeah.
Wow,
So
that's amazing.
But the reparations is a real example, and has been in some form or another adopted in cases around the country where police violence and police brutality in New Orleans and in Little Rock and in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Most recently, there was a very late apology for the police role in the massacre of 5 anti-Klan demonstrators.
Another
in
case
Greensboro.
that People's Law Office was involved in.
Yeah, I was involved in that case.
And I wanted to ask you, before we finish, what became of Jon Burge? He never did get convicted of the torture, but tell us the story of Jon Burge. What happened to him?
Well, as I mentioned, he started out as a MP sergeant in Vietnam, and that's where where he learned these tactics. And he brought him back to Chicago, and became a detective in 1972, and started to torture African American suspects in serious cases.
So it goes back to 72, really.
It does, and this is what we were able to uncover over the years. And he went on, and he was promoted to sergeant, and then he was promoted to lieutenant in charge of the violent, the crimes of violence unit at Area 2 on the south side in early 80s. And that's when the Andrew Wilson case happened.
Right.
And he continued with a crew of ass kickers, as they called themselves,
right.
Burge's ass kickers,
or the midnight crew is some.
Yeah, midnight
sometimes.
Crew, because also they worked the midnight shift where they were, they could do more and in front of less people.
Right.
And that went on throughout the 80s, and Burge, because of all of his success, quote unquote, in getting confessions, was promoted again to commander, and moved over to the west side at Area 3. And that continued until, our trial. When we went on trial, Burge was the defendant in 1989. And as I said, we were fighting a case where we had one black uneducated cop killer versus a decorated commander of police from Vietnam.
Right. With an incredibly biased judicial system and administrative system and everything against you.
But that, because of Deep Badge and Conroy and all we uncovered, the police took a second look at Burge in 1990 because of all this evidence that was coming out. And in 1991, they decided that he should be fired for his torture of Andrew Wilson.
Right.
They also came up with a report that said it was a systemic problem of torture under Burge. And the chief of police at that time, or the superintendent, suppressed that report because they didn't really want that to be part of the narrative.
I see.
But Burge went to a hearing before the police board in 1992, and in 1993 he was fired. However, he was allowed to keep his police pension, and he moved to Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the next...
At that point, paid no price for this.
Yeah, exactly. And we continued fighting these cases, and the community and various organizations started to take up various aspects of this struggle, both nationally, locally, and internationally. And people were released from death row, and civil suits were brought, and people, we were able to develop even more evidence of this systemic torture. And then we get to the early 2000s, and we take the case to the United Nations, and the United Nations issues a report that condemns the police torture here in Chicago. But nothing's really happening here, and officially of course, the prosecutors, who was Richard Devine at that point, and then Anita Alvarez, they're not going to prosecute Burge.
Right.
There's a special prosecutor that's appointed, and he determines that he can't prosecute Burge. He's an old-time former state's attorney and judge.
And you're running out of time at this point because of the statute of limitations.
Yeah. We had created some theories where Burge could be prosecuted. But the statute of limitations for the actual torture had run out. But we finally got the U.S. attorney here in Chicago interested in Burge in a serious way, and that they investigated on the proposition that he had lied under oath in some of these civil cases that had been brought against Burge, and that statute had not run on those, on that perjury and obstruction of justice, because he had done that in the early 2000s.
Oh, more recently,
yes.
Right.
So, ironically, I suppose you could say, Burge was indicted in 2008, not for the torture, because the statute had run and the cover-up had successfully worked for all those years,
right,
when he could have been indicted for, attempted murder or torture or aggravated battery, what have you. He was indicted, and a predominantly white jury, after hearing evidence from Andrew Wilson via transcript, because Andrew had died in prison.
Right.
Anthony Holmes, who was one of the original electric shock victims, and several other Burge torture survivors, all testified that they'd been tortured. And then one former Burge detective was given immunity, and he kind of said that he'd watched Burge put a plastic bag over a victim, Shadid Mumin's head.
So for the first time, an actual eyewitness of torture.
Well,
came
right,
out.
A cop.
A cop. Yeah.
But of course, the pressure was so great on him after he said this at the grand jury that he came in at the trial and tried to back off of it. But the U.S. attorney was able to use his prior testimony. So anyway, the jury, I think I can't remember if it was 11 whites or 10 whites, but they went out, and this is a remarkable piece, but kind of shows you the depth of Burge's racism. There was a state's attorney, former state's attorney, who was attending the trial, and he later became defense lawyer, or he left the state's attorney's office, but he Burge considered him a friend. And while the jury was out, I don't know if you remember this, but down by the federal building, if you go across the street to the south, there's an outdoor bar.
Yeah.
And I think it was called Sullivan's. And Burge was sitting there while the jury was out, and this fellow, he confided this to me at a function where I think he might have had one too many drinks.
A little loose.
Yeah. And he told me that he walked by and Burge, said, "Hey, come over here," And he says, Burge said to me, "Do you think that jury will believe that bunch of N-words?"
Oh.
They did believe those African American victims of Burge, and they convicted him of perjury and obstruction of justice, and he got a 4.5-year sentence. There's a very courageous judge, federal judge named Joan Lefkoe, who happened to be a classmate of mine at Northwestern Law School many, many years ago.
Right.
And she ran a very fair trial. Wasn't intimidated by Burge or any of the police lawyers that represented him, and she sentenced him to 4.5 years, which was she was kind of restricted in terms of the fact he couldn't be prosecuted or convicted of torture.
Right. So she had a limited
scope of sentencing.
Got it.
But he went to Butner.
He went to where?
Butner Federal Penitentiary.
Oh, okay.
And I actually had the occasion to go and see him in prison garb and take his deposition down there in Butner.
Right.
And so I felt like I was a witness to the fact that Burge had gone full cycle here and gone from decorated Vietnam commander to a prisoner.
Right.
Prisoner like so many of the men that he put in prison.
Right, although much easier circumstances, I'm sure.
But he got out, and he remarkably convinced 4 members of the Illinois Supreme Court that he could keep his pension while he was in prison.
Oh, you're kidding. So he kept his pension while in prison.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And got out, and he was suffering from... I think, I don't know, some form of cancer, and he was quite sick by the time he got out of prison. But he was, to his dying day, he never was at all remorseful, never admitted anything, would take the Fifth Amendment when he was questioned under oath, but spoke to the media and condemned the reparations and condemned me and condemned the torture survivors, called them scum and all of that. He died a couple of years ago. But when he died, the Tribune and the Sun-Times, the narrative, which again I feel that we had a significant role in helping to establish, that was told in the Tribune and in the Sun-Times, was that this was a notorious serial racist torturer, and that and also Daley's name was mentioned as someone who was involved in the cover-up. And
who accommodated this torture.
Yes. So
things have, what you're saying is that these media enterprises that had been denying it or not covering it at all or ignoring it had finally come out and told the truth.
Well, it was a process, and people like Carol Maureen, we would always be able, when we had something important in this torture scandal, we knew that people like Carol, of course, John Conroy,
right.
But Carol was in the in the straight media, so to speak.
Yeah,
and she'd lead the news with something about Daley or something about Burge when we would get new information.
Yeah, so, she was an exceptional journalist.
She was,
sure.
And there were others along the way who Phil Walters was another one who was very good early on in terms of this, and I could name others, Charles Thomas, but it was a long, hard battle to bring out that evidence and to change that narrative, and that's why the teaching of the scandal in the schools is so important, because that continues to put forward the true story of the torture scandal, and we know that if you don't continue to fight for the truth and teaching that history, that the powers that be will go right back to the original narrative.
That's right. Those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it over and over again, unfortunately. I wanted to ask you one last thing to wrap this up. Just these amazing cases that you worked on many times for, like in the Hampton case, 13 years or 30 years on this Burge case. I just was wondering what kept you going, what keeps you going during all these years of, it's very difficult work to keep going. I just was curious.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. You're inspired by many of your clients, whether it be Fred Hampton or Daryl Cannon or other torture survivors, so many others along the way that I've represented that have shown such strength and courage to fight and continue to fight. That gives you a tremendous amount of strength as well. I think about the widows of the folks that were murdered by the Klan in Greensboro.
Yeah.
And
like Deborah Johnson, the widow of, or the and Fred Hampton.
Right, and Iberia Hampton, who stood with us through that entire 18-month trial and became, like Jeff Hausen, my second mother. She was just an incredibly strong person. Yes, many folks like that. Also, the people I work with, always been great people to work with and strong people who were uncompromising and continue to be uncompromising in their work, as well as my family, having a very strong family, both my parents, my brother, my sister, my wife, who's a long-time public interest lawyer, my daughter, who's now a public interest defense lawyer.
She got the gene.
She got, from both sides.
Both of you, right?
Yeah, I think for sure.
Destined.
Yeah, and I'd be lying if I said that if we never won anything, that it would, it would be the accomplishments both in and out of court. I mean, I think that as an American history major, as someone who aspires to writing, as someone who really takes an interest in what you might call, for lack of a better word, people's history, the Howard Zinn approach to history.
Right.
That the fact that I'm able to not only from time to time be involved in accomplishments, whether, and changing the narrative of these important cases, but to actually write about it and to talk to people about it, to speak about it, to teach to some degree about it, particularly to the younger lawyers and the younger generation, because I think it's so important what young folks are doing now. I mean, it's crucial to the continued existence of this planet.
That's right.
And I have a tremendous amount of respect for them, and hopefully they can learn a few things from their elders about what we all went through and what we know and what our history teaches them today.
That's great. Well, Flint Taylor, it has been a real honor to talk to you and hear your story. I want to remind people that Flint's book is called The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. It came out, about a year and a half ago. It's a great book, and, it's just a very important read for so many of us. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, and keep up the great work.
Oh, thank you, Bob. And I would mention that the book is Haymarket. It's put out by a great publisher, Haymarket
Right,
Books.
Haymarket, the publisher.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And also the story of Haymarket, which happened here in Chicago.
Yes, that's another podcast.
That's another podcast. We got many of them. All right, Flint, thank you so much.
You're
Talk
welcome.
to you soon.
Thank you for tuning into the show. If you'd like to learn more about what was discussed in both episodes with Flint Taylor, you can find his book, The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago, at haymarketbooks.com, or just Google The Torture Machine. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, leave us a rating and review so more people can hear about us, and share about Rhythm of Life on social media, and like us on Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Ordauer.
This has been a Rhythm and Light production.